But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Daniel 12:4. They sealed it. They tried to bury it. But what Daniel saw is now unfolding right before our eyes. Beasts, blasphemy, resurrection, a kingdom that will never fall. This isn't fiction, it's prophecy, and it's happening now. In the end, knowledge will rise, but only the faithful will stand. Join us, stay awake. If you love God and honor His word, subscribe. Be part of the remnant. This is the biblical destiny, and Daniel's dreams are no longer just dreams. The night was heavy, like the sky itself had forgotten how to breathe. Wind whispered through the open lattice of Daniel's chamber, but the air felt wrong too still, too knowing. His eyes burst open, drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a drumbeat against the silence. He sat up, trembling. The dream hadn't faded like others. No, this one clung to him. It clawed at his spirit with images too vivid, too alive. He rose in the dark, barefoot on cool stone, and walked to the window. Babylon lay quiet under the moon's watch, her towers casting long shadows over a city that worshipped golden gods and crushed the weak beneath jeweled sandals. But even the idols seemed to bow to something deeper tonight, something not made with human hands, something ancient and eternal. He lit a small lamp with shaking hands. Then he began to write. The reed pen scratched across the parchment in hurried strokes. He had to capture it before memory unraveled it into madness. 4 great beasts emerging from the sea, one after another. They weren't just animals. They were empires. They were rulers. They were powers that wore crowns and trampled the earth. And then that 4th beast, monstrous, iron-jawed, relentless. It had no name, because no name could contain it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the little horn. It rose after the 10, small, insignificant, until it spoke, and its voice pierced like a blade, arrogant, blasphemous, eyes like a man, but cold and cruel. It devoured truth and mocked heaven. Daniel felt his own spirit groan at the memory. It had waged war against the holy ones, and it had won. For a time, he looked at what he had written. None of it made sense, and yet, it made too much sense. Something deep inside him whispered that this dream wasn't just for his time. It was for the end of nations, the end of peace, the end of pretending that kingdoms could stand apart from heaven's rule. Daniel dropped the pen. He sank to his knees, clutching his chest, trying to still the storm inside him. This wasn't like the visions he'd interpreted for kings. This one had no statue, no golden head, no silver chest. This one wasn't veiled in metaphor, it came alive with fury. He was no longer a prophet interpreting someone else's nightmare. This time, God had given him his own. And Daniel was afraid. He didn't yet know what the beasts meant, or how long the holy ones would suffer, or when the judgment would fall. But something had been set in motion. Something no man could stop. Outside, the stars continued their silent dance. Inside, the sleepless prophet whispered into the shadows, "Lord, what have you shown me?" The waters churned beneath a sky torn with lightning. Wind howled across the blackened deep, not like weather but like warning. Daniel stood in the middle of it all, not as a man, but as a witness, his feet unanchored, his soul trembling. He couldn't blink, he couldn't breathe, because from that raging sea, the beasts began to rise. The first came like a storm wrapped in majesty, a lion powerful, golden, regal. But its wings, they were wings of an eagle, sharp and wide, lifting it above the turmoil. It looked like dominion itself, fierce and proud. Then, before his eyes, the wings were torn off. The lion stood upright like a man, and a heart was given to it. Not the heart of a beast, but of a human. The pride fell, and something softer entered. Before he could understand, the sea exploded again. The second beast dragged itself up with terrifying weight, a bear lopsided, as if one side devoured more than the other. It held 3 ribs clenched between its teeth, like bones from an unfinished conquest. Blood dripped from its mouth, A voice thundered above the storm, "Arise, devour much flesh." This was no mere animal. It was conquest incarnate, ruthless, hungry, unbalanced. Its breath reeked of fallen nations. Then came the third. It moved like a shadow over the waves. A leopard, but not like any on earth. It had 4 wings too fast to follow and 4 heads, each one looking in a different direction, each hungry to rule. Dominion was given to it, not earned, given. Like the heavens themselves handed power into its claws. It didn't conquer by strength, but by speed. Kingdoms fell before they knew they were under siege. It was beautiful and terrifying. Then the 4th rose. Daniel staggered backward. He had no name for it, no words. No beast in heaven or on earth could compare. Its body was forged of metal and malice, teeth like iron, claws like war machines. It devoured, crushed, and shattered what remained of the others. It didn't fight, it consumed. Whatever it couldn't eat, it trampled. It was brutal beyond language, crafted for destruction, not dominion. 10 horns rose from its hediac, one like a crown. Then, from the midst of them, a smaller horn appeared. Just one. But it had eyes, and it spoke. Daniel covered his ears. The voice was blasphemy shaped into language. It mocked heaven. It defied the holy. It exalted itself. And yet the others followed. The sea quieted, but the beasts did not vanish. They remained etched into his vision like scars on stone. Daniel knew they weren't just monsters. They were kingdoms, rulers, spirits of empire. And the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. It didn't begin with thunder. It began with a whisper. The 4th beast still prowled in Daniel's vision, iron-jawed, unrelenting, its breath hot with violence. 10 horns crowned its head, each a symbol of power, authority, a dominion that trampled everything in its path. But then, from among them, something smaller began to grow. At first, it was almost invisible, a tiny horn, unthreatening, forgettable. But it did not stay that way. The horn grew eyes. Not the empty sockets of a creature, but human eyes, calculating, intelligent, alive. And then it spoke. Not in the roar of beasts, but in the voice of arrogance. Boastful, brazen. Words poured out like poison dressed in poetry. It didn't snarl, it seduced. It didn't bite, it deceived. And yet, behind every word was violence. This horn didn't need armies to begin a war. It waged it with speech, with blasphemy, with claims that reached up to heaven itself. Daniel watched in horror as the little horn rose higher, displacing 3 of the others as it climbed. There was no negotiation, no mercy, just quiet elimination. And then came something darker. The horn turned its fury not toward beasts or kingdoms, but toward the holy ones, the saints, the faithful, the ones who still called upon the name of the Most High. And it overcame them. The vision twisted with smoke and screams. The holy ones were hunted, scattered, worn down not by sword alone, but by exhaustion. Time itself seemed to bend under the weight of this horn's reign. It changed laws. It altered seasons. It rewrote truth. And the world followed. Daniel gripped his chest in the dream, heart pounding. This was no ordinary king, no simple empire. This was something deeper, a spirit, a shadow that extended beyond one generation, one ruler, one nation. The little horn was both a man and more than a man, a system, an idea, a throne built not on bloodlines, but on rebellion against heaven. It sought worship, demanded obedience, crushed dissent. It wore crowns and carried scripture, but its allegiance was only to itself. And yet, despite its power, despite its victories, it was doomed. Daniel saw a court convened a higher authority beyond the reach of empires. Thrones set in fire, books opened. The Ancient of Days took his seat, and the verdict was written before the trial began. The little horn's dominion would not last, but Daniel could still feel its shadow, lingering like smoke after a fire. He didn't know its name. He didn't need to. He knew it was real. It was rising, and it would come again. And even now, its voice still echoes through history. The beasts raged below, but suddenly the sky split open like parchment torn by unseen hands. The fury of kingdoms was silenced, swallowed by something far greater than power. Thrones appeared, flames curling at their feet, wheels of fire spinning beneath them. And then a presence descended, not rushed, not violent, but eternal, unshakable. Daniel fell to his knees as the light engulfed him. He could not see the fullness of the figure, only the awe it left in its wake. Garments white as snow, hair like pure wool, not from age but from holiness. Ancient, not because of time, but because time came after him. He was not a king made by men, he was the source from which kings borrowed their breath. The Ancient of Days took his seat, and the heavens held their breath. His throne blazed with fire, not symbolic, but real. A river of flame flowed from before him, pouring out judgment and truth. Thousands upon thousands stood before him, not soldiers, not beasts, but witnesses, servants of light, heavenly ones who needed no crown to stand in authority. And then the court was called to order. The books were opened, not books of myth or memory, but records, deeds, secrets, the words and motives of every kingdom, every throne, every heart. Nothing was hidden. The rise and fall of empires was not chaos, it was being weighed, measured, judged. And the beasts, for all their fury, stood small beneath his gaze. Then Daniel saw the fourth beast again, still defiant, still crushing. But its time had come. The Ancient of Days spoke, not with thunder, but with finality. The beast was slain, its body destroyed, thrown into the blazing fire. Not slowly, not dramatically. It was judged, and it was ended, just like that. The other beasts, those that came before, had their dominion stripped away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season. Their judgment had not yet come, but it would, because this was no ordinary court. This was not Babylon. This was not Persia. This was heaven's throne, and the verdicts spoken here were eternal. Daniel trembled. He had seen kings fall. He had interpreted dreams and stood in palaces. But this was beyond empires and eras. This was the place where justice wasn't delayed. It was declared, and written, and sealed. The Ancient of Days sat unmoved, unthreatened, untouched by the chaos below. His throne did not burn. It burned brighter. He wasn't reacting to history. He was writing it. And every beast, every horn, every arrogant word was already accounted for. Daniel wept, not in fear, but in awe, because in a world where kings rise in pride and fall in violence, there still exists a throne that cannot be shaken, and the one who sits upon it sees all and forgets nothing. Out of the fire and judgment, amid the thunder of open books and silenced beasts, Daniel saw something he could barely describe, because it looked like a man, but more than a man. He came not from the earth, not from kingdoms rising out of the sea, but from the heavens themselves, riding the clouds, clothed in majesty, not trembling, not begging, not crushed like the saints or boastful like the horn. He came with stillness, with purpose, and the heavens made way for him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The Ancient of Days, seated in fire and glory, turned his gaze toward this one. No words were needed. No trial held. Dominion was given. Glory handed over. A kingdom placed into his hands, not seized by conquest or violence, but received like a birthright. The Son of Man stood before the throne of eternity, and nothing in creation resisted. Daniel watched as the angels moved not to stop him, but to serve him. Every nation, every tribe, every language bowed, not out of fear, but recognition. There was no terror in his rule, only truth. No shadow in his reign, only light. This was not another beast rising to consume the earth. This was the answer to it all. He was everything the others were not. His kingdom was not carved from war or held together by fear. It was not passed from father to son, not vulnerable to rebellion or rot. It was eternal, unshakable, a dominion that would not fade like Babylon's gold or Persia's silver. It would not fracture like Greece or crush like Rome. His kingdom was made of something different: righteousness, justice, glory that did not decay. And Daniel knew this Son of Man would not just rule, he would redeem. He would not only be crowned, he would carry the pain of those crushed beneath the beasts, the holy ones, the faithful ones, the ones who endured. Dominion was given to him so that they could be lifted with him. Their suffering would not be wasted. Their silence would not be forgotten. He saw it now. The beasts had their hour, the horn had its voice, but the Son of Man had the future, and it would not be taken from him. Daniel trembled not in dread, but in hope, because if the Son of Man had come once in vision, he would come again in time, and when he did, no beast would stand, no throne would rival, and no kingdom would ever rise again that did not bow to his. The fire of judgment had not only revealed wrath, it had revealed the King. Daniel sat alone in the dark, his hands still trembling, the scroll unrolled before him like a wound that refused to close. The vision burned behind his eyes: beasts, fire, judgment, and that figure like the Son of Man. He had seen too much, and yet understood too little. His breath was shallow, his body was weak, but it was his spirit that ached the most. He could not sleep, he could not eat. The glory of heaven had collided with the horrors of empire, and he was caught in the middle. Not just a prophet anymore, but a witness to things no man was ever meant to carry alone. So he begged, "Lord, what does it mean?" And heaven answered. A figure stood near him, radiant, calm, but heavy with knowledge. Daniel didn't know if it was an angel or something more, but the voice that followed was unmistakable. It did not comfort, it revealed. "These great beasts," the figure said, "are 4 kings, 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth." Daniel closed his eyes. They were not allegories, not old myths. These were real. Nations that would consume in his lifetime, others long after his bones turned to dust. The lion, the bear, the leopard, the beast of iron, they were the future. And the horn, it would rise when the world no longer feared God, when even the faithful grew weary. It would speak, and many would listen. Daniel opened his mouth, but his voice cracked before it reached the air. The figure continued, "But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess it forever." It should have been hope, but to Daniel, it felt like thunder waiting to fall. If the holy ones were to inherit a kingdom, that meant they must first endure, suffer, be overcome. He saw it in the vision. The horn waged war against them, and it prevailed. He staggered to his knees. Was this the plan? That the righteous would be crushed before they were crowned? That evil would not only rise but reign, even if just for a season? His heart was torn, not because he doubted God, but because he saw how long the road would be. The figure's voice grew quiet. "Times and law and seasons, they will change, but judgment shall sit, and the kingdom shall be given to the people of the Most High." It was a promise, but it did not lift the weight. It deepened it. Daniel rose to his feet, but only barely. The dream was over, but the burden had just begun. The kingdoms were coming. The beasts would rise. The saints would suffer. But in the end, the Ancient of Days would speak. Still, Daniel's spirit was grieved, because the end was glorious. But the middle was war. It came without warning. Another vision. Another night that offered no rest. Daniel found himself beside a river, the water silent, the sky bruised with an otherworldly tension. And there, from the east, a ram emerged, majestic, proud, and terrible. Its 2 horns stretched upward, one higher than the other. It charged westward, northward, and southward. Nothing stood in its way. No beast could resist it. No wall could contain it. The ram trampled and conquered, and none could deliver from its power. This was dominion. This was unchallenged might, until the silence shattered. A goat came from the west fast, furious, like it flew just above the earth, never touching the ground. Between its eyes, a single horn, sharp, defiant, unrelenting. It came with a vengeance, its fury aimed at the ram with a precision born not of ambition, but destiny. The collision was violent. The goat struck the ram with such force that the great beast staggered, then fell. It was trampled, destroyed, left broken in the dust. What once ruled now bled into memory. Daniel stood frozen, the sound of hooves echoing through his soul. Then the goat grew stronger. The horn between its eyes pulsed with pride. But power, once exalted, is never secure. Without warning, the horn snapped. No sword, no enemy, just time, just God. And from the shattered root rose 4 new horns, each pointing in a different direction. Not as fierce, not as fast, but still filled with dominion. The single vision became a map of division, a kingdom fractured before it could even mature. Daniel's hands shook. This wasn't myth. This was history before it happened. He would later learn the names. Media and Persia Ram, twin kingdoms rising as one. Greece, the goat, led by a king whose ambition knew no boundary. Alexander the Great, a horn that conquered everything but his own mortality. And after him, his kingdom split in 4, his empire scattered to the winds. But Daniel didn't yet know those names. He only knew the fear in his chest, the swirl of power and collapse, the truth that every horn, no matter how sharp, breaks. Every ruler, no matter how swift, falls. This was not the story of men. It was the story of God behind men, of heaven writing history in the dust of human pride. The ram rose, the goat struck, the horn shattered, 4 took its place. And above it all, Daniel still stood by the river, alone, heart pounding, eyes wide watching the world change before it ever had a chance to begin. From the winds of the broken empire, one horn began to grow not. Large, not loud, but deliberate. It rose slowly, almost unnoticed, but Daniel felt its weight before it spoke. There was something cold in it, something sharp behind the silence. It was not born to lead, it was born to conquer, and it would do so without mercy. The small horn grew great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It didn't roar like the beasts before it. It whispered. It deceived. It crept into power not by might, but by manipulation. A fierce king, Daniel would later hear it called a master of intrigue. His strength wasn't in armies alone. It was in arrogance and cruelty. He desecrated the holy. He defiled the sanctuary. Daniel watched, frozen in horror, as the horn reached upward past nations, past king-stowed heaven itself. It cast down the host of heaven. It trampled the stars. It challenged the very commander of heaven's army, and for a time, it succeeded. The daily sacrifices were halted. Truth was thrown to the ground. The sanctuary was violated, and the people of God suffered. Not by the blade alone, but by deception, by fatigue, by confusion. This king did not just destroy bodies. He shattered hope. He mocked worship. He desecrated what was sacred, until even the faithful began to wonder if God still saw them. Daniel's spirit broke at the sight. He didn't yet know the name Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler who centuries later would invade the temple, slaughter thousands, and place a statue of Zeus where the ark once rested. A man who lit the fires of one of Israel's darkest hours. But even then, Daniel knew this vision pointed beyond one moment in time, because the shadow of the horn was too long. This was a pattern, not a person, a spirit of blasphemy that would rise again, in every age, in every system, in every throne that exalts itself above heaven. This king was not just history, he was a warning. A time would come when another like him would rise bolder, darker, more cunning, a figure not just of tyranny, but of prophecy, one who would make war not only with swords, but with lies, one who would not just defile temples, but hearts. And just like before, many would bow. Daniel stood in the aftermath of the vision, sickened, shaken. The sanctuary lay in ruins, the truth lay trampled, and yet, the vision did not end there, because no matter how fierce the king, or how high the horn rose, there was one thing it could never touch. The time was appointed, the days were numbered, and heaven had already written the final word. Even the fierce must fall. The silence after the desecration was unbearable. Daniel stood in the middle of it, surrounded by the ruins of what once was holy. The sanctuary, once alive with incense and song, now defiled. The sacrifices ceased, the altar dark, and overhead, heaven watched without blinking. Then he heard a voice not of man, but of something greater. A holy one spoke across the distance, as if time itself paused to listen. "How long?" the voice asked, not in doubt, but in pain. "How long will the vision last, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling of the host?" And then came the answer, quiet, precise, like a sword sliding from its sheath. "Until 300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Daniel froze. The number echoed like thunder in his bonesto. 300. Not days, not years, but evenings and mornings. And though the words were simple, their meaning hung like fog, thick and unresolved. Was it literal Timion, 150 days of defilement, each day counted twice, evening and morning? Or was it 300 full days, stretching out over 6.5 years of silence, darkness, and shame? Daniel didn't know. He only knew this. There was an end. The pain would not be forever. The desecration had a deadline. But when did it start? He searched the vision for an anchorsome moment, some event, to begin the countdown. Was it the first rebellion? The first offering trampled? The first decree that halted sacrifice? Or was it yet to come some future moment, sealed beyond his lifetime? The question haunted him, because it wasn't just about a number. It was about endurance, about knowing whether suffering was permanent or purposed, about whether heaven still held the clock. And Daniel realized something as he stood in that vision. Even judgment is timed. Even pain has a measure. Even darkness is allowed only so many steps before light returns. The sanctuary would be cleansed. He didn't see how, he didn't see when, but the words were spoken by heaven itself. Not maybe, not if, it would be. Still, Daniel's spirit was torn, because 300 evenings and mornings meant days of silence, of injustice, of watching the sacred turned into spectacle. It meant generations asking if God had left, if the holy had been forgotten, if the beasts had won. But they hadn't. Because behind every horn, every tyrant, every desecration, there was a countdown. Heaven had not forgotten. Daniel clung to that number like a thread in the dark. He didn't understand it fully, but he believed it. Because in a world where kings fall and temples burn, sometimes the only thing more powerful than judgment is the promise of restoration. And that promise had a name. 300. The vision ended, but the weight of it did not. Daniel stumbled from the place where heaven had spoken, his body trembling, his soul unraveling. The numbers, the beasts, the desecration, it all pressed down on him like stone on flesh. He couldn't eat, he couldn't speak, he couldn't move without the tremor of divine fire still clinging to his bones. Days passed, then weeks. But the silence from heaven was louder than thunder. He mourned, he fasted, he wept without tears. For 21 days he ate no choice food, tasted no wine, touched no ointment. His garments were worn, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He had interpreted dreams for kings. But this was no ordinary vision. This was the unraveling of empires, and still heaven said nothing. Until the 21st day, Daniel stood by the Tigris River, bones aching, body frail. Then the earth changed. The sky rippled. The air itself trembled. And suddenly, he was not alone. He looked up and fell like a dead man. A figure stood before him, clothed in linen, waist wrapped in gold, face like lightning. His eyes blazed with fire. His arms and legs burned like polished bronze in the furnace. And when he spoke, it wasn't a voice, it was an ocean breaking against the cliffs. Thunder, waters, glory, words that shattered the silence between heaven and earth. The men with Daniel fled. They didn't even see the vision, but the presence crushed them. Only Daniel remained. But he could not stand. He couldn't even lift his head. His strength had left him like breath escaping a broken jar. Then the figure moved closer. A hand touched him gentle, yet charged with power. "Do not be afraid, Daniel," the voice said, thunder made intimate. "From the moment you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words were heard." Daniel's breath caught. "I have come because of your words." He tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound came. His body shook, but not from fear, from awe. The messenger continued. "For 21 days, I was resisted, held back by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me." Daniel blinked. Heaven had been at war while he fasted. His silence was not ignored, it was answered in combat. Angels and principalities clashing in realms he could not see. While he waited, the heavens were fighting. The hand strengthened him again. "Fear not, Daniel. You are greatly beloved." And with those words, strength returned not to his muscles, but to his spirit. He stood not as a man who had endured, but as one who had been chosen to see what others never would: the future, the war, the glory. And the hand that lifted him was not just a touch, it was a summons. Daniel stared into the face of the messenger light wrapped in form, fire held in restraint. The angel's presence filled the riverbank with a stillness that made the earth feel hollow. But it was the words that followed that made his knees shake again. "I was delayed," the angel said, voice low like distant thunder. "For 21 days the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Not a man, not a king, not flesh and bone. A prince, yes, but of another kind. A power behind the throne. A dominion unseen by eyes, but felt in policy, in cruelty, in silence." Daniel had lived long enough to know that empires didn't move on ambition alone. Now he understood why. The war was not just in palaces or battlefields. It was in the air, in the unseen. The Prince of Persia, spiritual, ancient, territorial, had resisted the answer to Daniel's prayer, not by accident, not by chance, but with intention, because what Daniel had seen, what Daniel was destined to hear, threatened the very rulers behind rulers. And so the answer was intercepted, not lost, just fought for. "But Michael," the angel said, and for a moment, even the air seemed to bow. "One of the chief princes came to help me." Daniel's heart stirred. Michael, the archangel, heaven's warrior, the protector of God's people. Where the darkness had drawn its lines, Michael had crossed them. Where the prince of Persia had tried to hold back revelation, Michael had cleared the path with divine force. This wasn't mythology. This was the hidden architecture of reality. Daniel had known kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, the lions of the earth. But now he saw deeper. Every empire had its throne, every throne had its prince in the shadows. Forces that moved history, whispered in courts, hardened hearts, provoked wars. But above them, behind them, beyond them, God still ruled. And heaven fought for his purposes. The angel looked at him not with pity, but urgency. "Now I have come to make you understand what shall befall your people in the latter days." And Daniel understood something he never had before. His prayers weren't just heard, they caused tremors in another world. His fasting, his mourning, had moved heaven to act, and hell to resist. The war was real, and it was raging. But he wasn't alone in the silence. Michael stood. The angel stood. And God had not forgotten. Daniel breathed deep, not in peace, but in purpose. The fight was not over. The visions were not finished. But now he knew. The empires of earth were not the true powers. The real battle was being fought in the unseen. And victory would not begin in the hands of kings, but in the heart of those who prayed. The vision shifted again, no longer beasts or flames, but banners, kingdoms, marching lines of men drawn in sand and blood. Daniel stood on the edge of time itself, watching history roll forward like thunder. And at the center of it all, two powers, one from the north, one from the south, both locked in a dance older than they understood. A war not just of armies, but of pride, of prophecy, of something unseen pushing behind the crowns. The king of the south rose first strong, bold, swift, His dominion stretched far. But soon, the king of the north answered, just as fierce, just as proud. They clashed like storms meeting over a desert, each convinced the world belonged to them. The south struck with fury. The north retaliated with cunning. Alliances formed, only to fracture. Treaties signed, only to be betrayed. And still, the pattern repeated. Generations passed. Sons became kings. Kings became shadows. But the titles never changed. Always the north. Always the south. One moment victorious, the next humbled. Power passed like sand through trembling fingers. Women were used as bargaining chips. Families betrayed one another for the illusion of peace. Armies marched through the glorious land, trampling what was sacred beneath boots of ambition. Daniel tried to follow the names, the dates, the turns, but it wasn't about the names. It was about the rhythm, chaos with a pattern. Every betrayal had a mirror, every invasion echoed what came before. It was as if time was being rehearsed, over and over, until it reached something final. And then Daniel saw it hidden beneath the movements of kings, behind the smoke of war and the masks of diplomacy and agenda. A spirit. These were not just battles for territory. They were rehearsals for something darker, something that would one day rise not from loyalty to a crown, but from hatred of the holy. From the north, one ruler would come, deceitful, brutal, proud. He would profane the covenant, exalt himself above God, and deceive many with flatteries. From the south, resistance but fractured, unstable. Daniel saw betrayal even among the faithful. Some would fall, some would stumble. Not all from weakness, but so they might be refined. This war wasn't just about land. It was about allegiance, about who would bow when power demanded worship. Daniel stood still, heart pounding. The kings would keep rising and falling. Thrones would be built and shattered. But one day, from among them all, a final figure would emerge. One who would not be content with land but would reach for heaven's throne itself. The pattern was leading somewhere, and Daniel saw it now. The chaos was not chaos. It was preparation. What Daniel saw next gripped his soul with a coldness no fire could warm. The temple, the place where heaven once touched earth, where blood once covered sin and incense once rose like hope, stood silent. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been invaded. A man entered, not with reverence, but with arrogance. A ruler, a destroyer, a deceiver crowned in cruelty. He didn't walk into the sanctuary as a pilgrim. He marched in as if it were his own throne room. And what he placed there, what he did in that holy place, Daniel could hardly look upon. The altar was stripped, the sacrifices were halted, and at the very heart of the temple stood something not made by God, but raised in defiance of him. An idol, a mockery, a presence so blasphemous it tore the heavens with silent screams. This was no ordinary desecration. It was deliberate, calculated, prophetic, the abomination that desolates. Daniel's chest burned as he watched it unfold. The sanctuary, once pulsing with divine purpose, was now a theater for pride. What was meant to cleanse now reeked with filth. What was meant to restore now echoed with laughter. Not the laughter of joy, but of mockery. The holy had been turned into a warning, and that warning was not just for then. This moment, this act, was a shadow cast into the future, a pattern that would repeat again and again, not always in temples built with stone, but in hearts, in nations, in systems. The spirit behind the abomination was older than the ruler who placed it. It was rebellion wrapped in ritual, a declaration that said, "We will rule without God. We will worship what we choose. We will be our own salvation." Daniel understood now why the vision had been sealed for the end, because what he saw in one ruler would be echoed in many. Antiochus would come. He would enter the temple. He would slaughter, defile, destroy. But another would follow, a greater tyrant, a final horn, one who would not just desecrate a building, but demand the worship of the world. And many would give it. The abomination was not only an object, it was a line, a point of no return. When it appears, judgment is close. When it stands where it should not, the end is near. Daniel clutched his robe, trembling, because once something holy has been defiled, only fire can cleanse it. And fire was coming. The angel's voice grew heavy, each word soaked in warning. Daniel could feel the weight of it before the phrase was even spoken. These visions concern the time of the end. Not the end of one kingdom, not the fall of a city, but the unraveling of an age. Daniel's hands tightened around the edges of his robe. He had seen empires rise and collapse. He had stood in courts where gods of gold and kings of stone demanded worship. He had witnessed the madness of tyrants and the mercy of God. But this was different. What the vision pointed to was not just history, it was judgment in motion, a storm building across time, the time of wrath. It would not arrive with fanfare. It would come wrapped in brilliance promises, progress, peace. But underneath it, a rot, a fury restrained only by prophecy. Daniel saw a world swollen with pride, where truth became intolerable and power was traded like coin. The faithful would not be celebrated, they would be hunted. Silence would feel safer than conviction, and still, they would stand. This was not punishment without cause. This was testing, refining. A furnace meant not to destroy the righteous, but to reveal them. Deception would reign, the powerful would speak like gods, and many would listen. Laws would change, worship would be twisted, good would be mocked. Evil would be crowned with applause, and even the wise would stumble for a time. Daniel saw the holy ones wearied, not just attacked, but worn down slowly, methodically, like wind against stone, like lies against memory. Their prayers would feel unanswered, their hope tested, their hearts stretched thin between faith and fear. But it was not forever, because wrath was not the end, it was the threshold. Through it, a remnant would rise. Not strong in numbers, but in clarity, refined like gold in fire. They would not bow, they would not yield, and their endurance would become a testimony more powerful than miracles. Daniel's eyes burned. This was not just a story for his people or his time. It was a letter sealed for the end of the age, a warning whispered across centuries, a voice calling to those who would one day stand where he now knelt, shaken, grieving, burning with questions, but still faithful. The time of wrath was not coming. It was appointed, and the one who had set it would also bring it to its close, not with whispers but with the sound of heaven opening, with justice that could not be bribed, with glory that no tyrant could touch. Daniel bowed his head to the earth, because the shaking was near, and still, God would stand. Daniel had given everything: his strength, his tears, his sleep. He had endured visions that made kings tremble and angels pause. And now, with his hands still shaking and his heart still burning, he begged, "Lord, what does it mean? What will become of all this?" The heavens were quiet. Then, the angel answered not with clarity, but with closure. "Go your way, Daniel. The words are closed and sealed until the time of the end." Daniel's breath caught. After everything he had seen, beasts, horns, kings, wars, the Son of Man, the Ancient of Days, the fire, the fury, now silence, sealed. It felt like reaching for light and being handed shadow. But this was not denial. It was delay, not for lack of love, but because the time was not his. The visions he received were written for another generation, a people not yet born, a world not yet shaken, a time when knowledge would increase, when men would run to and fro, and when the seal would finally break. Daniel had been chosen to see, but not to fully understand. He was a scribe of eternity, writing letters to the last generation, a voice crying out in the stillness of ancient days, echoing into a future thick with trembling. The scroll would not be read by Babylon, nor Persia. It would wait, it would sleep, until the ground cracked, and the sky dimmed, and the last horn rose. And in that hour, the words would speak again. Daniel lowered his head. This was not what he wanted. He had longed to map the end, to know the times, to feel the final thread unravel. But God had drawn a line, not of punishment, but of sovereignty. The knowledge was not lost, just sealed. And Daniel, he was told to go. to finish his race in faith, to close his eyes without answers but with peace, because what mattered more than knowing the end was trusting the one who wrote it. The angel's voice grew quiet now, almost tender. You will rest, not perish, not fade, rest. And at the end of the days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. Daniel wept not from fear, but from release. His burden was not to explain history. His calling was to carry the vision, to guard the mystery, to walk forward with sealed scrolls and an open heart. So he did. He walked away from the vision, from the fire, from the angels, not with all the answers, but with the promise that one day, when the time of the end had fully come, the seal would be broken, and the words would rise again like fire from ancient parchment, and the world would finally understand what Daniel only saw in part. Daniel saw the end not as a single explosion, but as a slow unraveling, a world not collapsing from weakness, but imploding from pride. It wasn't fire that came first. It was brilliance, achievement, the rise of knowledge, books opened, scrolls decoded, tongues translated, cities lit with inventions that would have seemed like miracles to Babylon's wisest men, machines that spoke, devices that watched, towers that touched the heavens not in stone, but in signal. Knowledge spread like wildfire, fast, boundless, everywhere at once. And yet peace fell, because while men learned how to master the stars, they forgot how to master themselves. While data multiplied, discernment withered. Truth no longer stood like a pillar. It was twisted, bartered, edited, changed with every season, every screen. What once required prayer now came from algorithms. What once came from heaven now echoed from hollow voices, speaking into glowing glass. People rushed to and fro across oceans, across borders, across platforms, but not to rest, not to listen, not to wait on God. They moved because stillness had become unbearable, because silence now felt like death. But the faster they ran, the more lost they became. Wisdom was no longer revered. It was ridiculed. The old ways prayer, repentance, reverence were mocked as relics, and those who clung to them were labeled as obstacles to progress. Peace was replaced with urgency, depth with noise, and evil didn't hide in shadow sit, stood proud in the light, applauded, justified, legalized. Daniel saw it all, the trampled truth, the twisted justice, the celebration of rebellion dressed as freedom. He had lived through empires. He had walked beside lions and kings. But this vision, this glimpse of a world where men knew everything but remembered nothing, it pierced him deeper than any beast. Because knowledge was never the enemy, but without fear of the Lord, it became a weapon. And in this final age, humanity would worship its own brilliance, exalt its own reflection, and in doing so, forget the very breath that gave them life. Daniel watched it unfold, nations swollen with information, but starving for wisdom, people connected by wires, but separated by hate, children growing old without innocence, saints growing silent in fear. It would be an age unlike any other, and the shaking wouldn't begin with war, it would begin with forgetting. Forgetting who made them, forgetting what truth is, forgetting the words Daniel had sealed. And yet, in that forgetting, the seal would break, the scrolls would be read, and the fire would fall. Because knowledge may rise, and peace may fall, but God does not forget, and truth does not die. The vision grew still. No more beasts, no more fire, just silence, stretched thin across eternity. And then, like a whisper breaking the edge of time, the angel spoke again. Many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel's heart stopped. This was not a metaphor. This was not a dream. This was the end beyond the end. The moment when time is unmade and every buried name is summoned not by memory, but by judgment. The dead will rise, not all at once, not all the same, but all accounted for. He saw it graves breaking open, not with violence, but with authority. Those long forgotten by the world, suddenly remembered by heaven. The faithful, worn and scarred, rising to light. Their pain exchanged for glory, their endurance crowned with life that never ends. No more tears, no more fear, just joy pure, undying, unshakable. But not all rose to life. Daniel saw others, those who rose only to bow too late, kings who once mocked heaven, priests who corrupted truth, judges who silenced justice. They rose, not to celebrate, but to face what they spent their lives denying. Their names not written in glory, but in shame. Their legacy, not eternal honor but contempt that echoed into forever. This was the great division, not between rich and poor, not between strong and weak, but between those who feared God and those who feared only death. Daniel felt the weight of it all. The resurrection was not just restoration, it was revelation. A mirror held up to every soul, every motive, every hidden thing. It was the unmasking of mankind, and there would be no more hiding. He saw the judgment of nations not by borders or flags, but by truth. Whole empires stood exposed, their sins shouted from rooftops, their secrets dragged into light. The scales held steady in heaven's hand, and nothing escaped the balance. But even now, there was hope, because those who led many to righteousness would shine like the stars forever. Not celebrities, not rulers, but the faithful, the unnoticed, the ones who chose truth when it cost them everything. They would shine not for a season, but for eternity. Daniel trembled, because this was the moment every prophet pointed toward, every scroll whispered of, the final turning of the age. And the only question that mattered now wasn't when it would happen, but which side you would rise on. Life or shame, glory or contempt, the crown or the sentence. And Daniel knew, with tears in his eyes, that no beast, no king, no horn could stop what was coming. Because the resurrection would not ask for permission, it would only ask one question: who did you live for? Daniel stood in the stillness, emptied by the weight of what he had seen. His body was old now. His eyes had witnessed the rise and ruin of empires. His hands had turned pages of prophecy written in fire and silence. But it was his soul that felt the heaviest. Not because it was afraid, but because it had been shown too much. The angel stood before him, not as a conqueror, but as a messenger of mercy. No more visions, no more beasts, just presence, peace, and a final promise. You will rest. The words fell softly, but they struck deep. Not die, not be forgotten, not fade into history. Rest. Like a soldier who has fought his last battle, like a watchman who has kept the night and now sees the dawn. Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. His breath trembled with the unspeakable beauty of those words. He had seen fire devour kings, stone smash idols, lions silenced by faith, and angels war in the unseen realms. He had fasted for truth, wept for wisdom, written what he could not understand, and now the journey was ending not with thunder, but with stillness. And then you will rise. It wasn't a wish, it was a decree. Just as the stars were named, just as time was measured, so too was Daniel's resurrection written into the fabric of eternity. You will rise to receive your allotted inheritance at the end of days. Not stolen glory, not borrowed joy, but his, allotted, given, promised. It would not come in his lifetime, not in Babylon, not in Persia, but when the earth shook one final time, when the scrolls were unsealed, when truth was no longer trampled and the Son of Man came in glory. Then Daniel would rise, not to interpret the future, but to inherit it. The vision faded. The angel stepped back into the brightness from which he came, and Daniel stood there alone, yet not abandoned. The world around him would forget. Kings would come and go. Statues would crumble. Temples would rise and fall. But his dreams would remain, because they weren't his. They were God's, sealed in the folds of time, waiting for a generation who would need them. A people standing at the edge of the end, searching for meaning in a world full of noise. And when they looked, the words would speak again. The dreams of Daniel still haunt us, still call to us, still burn with truth that cannot be silenced. because though the prophet now sleeps, the scroll is still alive.